The stars above the destroyed planet twinkled like tiny lights in the sky. The planet, once full of life, was now nothing but ruins. The explosions had been so loud that the very ground had shaken, breaking cities and crushing homes. Among the wreckage, two alien brothers stood alone. Their names were Zor and Kiv. Their eyes were wide with fear and sadness. They had lost everything: family, friends, and home. They had no place left to go. Zor, the older brother, tried to stay strong, but his hands trembled. Kiv, the younger one, was barely holding back tears. The two of them had nowhere to turn. They could feel the cold wind blowing over the ashes of their planet, but it was the loneliness that hurt the most. The only family they had left was each other, and now they had to find a way to survive. Far away from the wreckage, a group of humans was scouting the galaxy. The humans were part of a military operation that often helped displaced aliens. They had seen the destruction from a distance and decided to investigate. They sent a ship to the ruined planet, hoping to find survivors and give them shelter. The human ship landed in the middle of the wreckage. The crew was ready to help anyone who needed it, but they did not expect what they found. Zor and Kiv, covered in dirt and looking lost, were the only survivors. They had no way of knowing what had happened or why their world was gone. But the humans, seeing the two frightened alien brothers, knew they couldn't leave them behind. Captain John, the leader of the human team, ordered the brothers to be brought aboard the ship. The brothers had no choice but to follow. As they stepped aboard, they were met by cold, unfamiliar faces. The humans didn't speak their language, and the brothers couldn't understand the humans either. But there was no other choice. Zor and Kiv sat in a corner of the ship, feeling the weight of their new reality. They were no longer on their home planet, but they didn't know where they were going. The humans were used to dealing with aliens from all over the galaxy. They were cold, professional, and efficient. But Captain John was different. He was known for being tough. Some said he was too harsh. He didn't like showing weakness, and he didn't believe in being soft with anyone. He expected his team to be strong and follow orders. And when it came to the two alien brothers, he didn't treat them any differently. Zor and Kiv tried to rest, but sleep didn't come easy. The ship was noisy, and every time they closed their eyes, they saw flashes of their home planet exploding. Kiv turned to Zor, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you think they will hurt us?" he asked. Zor looked out the small window, his face sad. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but we don't have a choice. We have to trust them." The brothers were taken to a small room where they could sleep. Captain John didn't offer any comfort. He gave them food and water, then left them alone. The brothers sat in the silence, still unsure of their new life. What would happen to them now? In the morning, they were brought to meet Captain John again. This time, the human was different. He was serious, almost cold. He spoke to them in a language they didn't understand, but his tone was clear. They needed to follow the rules. He showed them how to wear human clothes and how to clean themselves. Zor and Kiv didn't want to look weak, but everything felt strange. They had never seen anything like this before. Captain John's orders were simple, but they were hard to follow. The brothers didn't know how to survive in a world that wasn't theirs. They didn't know how to act, how to speak, or how to fit in. But Captain John didn't care. He wasn't going to go easy on them. He didn't offer kindness. He just made sure they understood that they had to be strong, or they would not survive. For the next few days, Captain John kept a close eye on the brothers. He showed them how to defend themselves, how to survive on a strange ship in the middle of space. Zor and Kiv struggled. They didn't understand the rules of the human world. Everything was different from what they had known. But they also knew that they had no other choice but to keep going. Captain John's tough exterior made Zor and Kiv feel even more alone. They missed their home, their family, and everything they had lost. But they didn't know if they would ever find those things again. For now, the only thing they could rely on was each other. and the tough human who had taken them in. The days passed slowly for Zor and Kiv aboard the human ship. The new world they found themselves in was nothing like their home planet. It was cold, metallic, and noisy. They were surrounded by strange humans who spoke in a language the brothers couldn't understand. But it was Captain John, their new guardian, who scared them the most. Captain John was the leader of the human crew, and everyone respected him. Fearfully so. He was a man of few words, and those words were usually commands. He walked through the halls of the ship with an air of confidence, his heavy boots echoing in the silent corridors. His face was always serious, his eyes hard and unreadable. The brothers had never met anyone like him before. He wasn't kind, nor did he show any warmth. His only focus seemed to be on making sure everything went according to his strict rules. Zor and Kiv quickly learned that Captain John's rules were not negotiable. They had to wake up early, even before the sun rose, and begin their training. At first, the brothers thought they would get a chance to rest or recover from the trauma of losing their home. But Captain John didn't give them that luxury. He pushed them hard, demanding their full attention and effort in everything they did. There was no time for sadness or weakness. "Get up now," Captain John would bark, his voice cutting through the silence. "We don't have time for excuses." Zor and Kiv were shocked by how harsh the captain was. He didn't speak kindly to them, and he certainly didn't try to comfort them. Instead, he ordered them to complete tasks that were far beyond what they thought they could do. They had to clean the ship, practice hand-to-hand combat, and even learn how to use human weapons. The brothers were not prepared for this kind of life. They were used to their peaceful home, where they didn't have to fight to survive. The first few days were the hardest. Zor, the older of the two, tried to keep his younger brother, Kiv, strong, but even he struggled with the demanding training. He had never been forced to work so hard in his life. Captain John didn't care about their pain. If they made a mistake, they had to do it all over again. There was no mercy. "Do it right or don't do it at all," Captain John would say, his tone cold and unforgiving. "Weakness doesn't belong on this ship." Zor and Kiv wanted to argue, to ask why they were being treated this way. But they knew better than to challenge the captain. They were in his world now, and he held all the power. They had no choice but to follow his orders. As the days turned into weeks, the brothers grew tired and frustrated. They had no time to mourn their lost family or their destroyed planet. All they could think about was surviving. Every day felt like a battle, and Captain John was their toughest opponent. One day, after a particularly grueling training session, Kiv couldn't take it anymore. His hands were bruised, and his body ached from the endless exercises. He fell to the floor, exhausted, and on the verge of tears. "I can't do this," Kiv whispered, his voice shaking. "It's too hard. We'll never be good enough for him." Zor knelt beside him, his own body aching just as much. "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice low but steady. "Captain John is tough, but he's making us stronger. We can't give up." Kiv looked up at his older brother, his eyes filled with doubt. "But why does he have to be so mean? Why can't he show us kindness just once?" Zor sighed. He didn't have an answer. He didn't understand Captain John either, but he knew one thing: if they didn't learn from him, they would never survive. The world they were now in was harsh. It didn't care about their feelings or their past. It only cared about strength. The next day, as Captain John led them through another difficult task, Zor and Kiv pushed themselves harder than ever before. They weren't sure why Captain John treated them this way, but they started to see something behind his strictness. Every time they struggled, he was there, silently watching, making sure they didn't give up. He didn't show affection, but he was always there, pushing them to do their best. In the evenings, when the brothers sat alone in their small room, they would talk about Captain John. They didn't like his harshness, but they started to understand why he was the way he was. He was tough because life in the galaxy was tough. He had to be that way to survive. And maybe, just maybe, He was teaching them how to survive too. As time passed, Zor and Kiv slowly started to respect Captain John. They began to see that his tough love, as hard as it was helping them. They were becoming stronger, learning things they never thought possible. They were learning how to defend themselves, how to adapt to this new life. It wasn't easy, and they still missed their home, but they were beginning to understand that their new guardian wasn't their enemy. He was their guide in this harsh new world. Days turned into weeks, and Zor and Kiv began to adapt to their new life aboard the human ship. The harsh training, the strict rules, and Captain John's tough approach were becoming their new reality. But something strange began to happen. They started noticing things about Captain John they hadn't seen before. Beneath his tough exterior, there was a side to him they couldn't quite understand, a side they never expected. It happened one evening after a long day of training. The brothers were sitting together in their small room, their bodies sore from the daily exercises. Kiv was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, while Zor was cleaning his hands from the dirt that had built up during training. "I don't get it," Kiv muttered, his voice quiet. "Why does he care so much about us? He's never nice, never shows any kindness." Zor sighed, glancing over at his younger brother. "I don't know, but I think he's trying to make us stronger. Maybe that's his way of showing he cares." Kiv frowned, "But it doesn't feel like he cares. He's always so cold." Zor didn't know how to answer that. It was true. Captain John was cold. But as they talked, a strange thought crossed his mind. Maybe the captain wasn't just tough because of his job. Maybe there was something more to it. Something he hadn't seen yet. The next day, after another exhausting training session, Captain John gave them a rare break. He told them to meet him in the ship's common room, and both brothers were confused. It was unusual for Captain John to take any time off, let alone give them time to relax. But they followed his orders, unsure of what to expect. When they arrived, Captain John was already sitting at a table, his hands folded in front of him. For once, his usual stern expression had softened. It was the first time Zor and Kiv had ever seen him look human. He wasn't barking orders, and he wasn't demanding anything. He simply sat there, waiting for them. "Sit," Captain John said, his voice not harsh this time, but calm. Zor and Kiv exchanged a look before they hesitantly sat down across from him. Captain John studied them for a moment, his eyes looking deep into theirs. "I know this hasn't been easy for you," he said quietly. "I've pushed you hard because I know what this galaxy can be like, and I know what it takes to survive. But I also know it's not just about strength, it's about trust." Zor and Kiv were stunned. They had never heard Captain John speak like this before. His voice, usually so cold and commanding, was now soft, almost caring. "Trust," Kiv whispered. "You want us to trust you?" Captain John nodded slowly. "Yes, but trust is not something that happens overnight. You have to earn it. And I'm not asking for your trust just because I'm the captain. I'm asking for it because I want you to know that I will always have your back, no matter what." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the brothers couldn't speak. They had always seen Captain John as a hard, uncaring leader, but now he was showing them a side they had never expected. The side of a person who cared about their well-being, who wanted to help them, not just train them. Zor was the first to speak, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "Why didn't you say this before? Why did you have to be so hard on us?" Captain John looked away for a moment, his eyes clouding over with something that looked like regret. "Because it's not easy to show weakness. I had to make you strong before you could understand what it really means to trust someone. The galaxy is full of dangers. I've seen too many people get hurt because they didn't understand that strength isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing who you can count on." Kiv shifted in his seat, his voice trembling slightly. "But we didn't ask for this. We didn't ask for any of it." Captain John's face softened. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. But sometimes life doesn't give us a choice. Sometimes we have to fight for what we want. And sometimes we have to trust people we don't understand. Zor looked down at his hands, his mind racing. Captain John's words felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Maybe he wasn't as cold and distant as he seemed. Maybe Captain John was just a man trying to survive in a world that demanded toughness. And maybe, just maybe, he cared more than he let on. "We'll try," Zor said quietly. "We'll try to trust you." Captain John nodded, his eyes showing a flicker of approval. "That's all I ask. But remember, you're not alone. You have each other. And now, you have me too." For the first time, Zor and Kiv felt a flicker of warmth in the captain's presence. It wasn't the warmth they had hoped for, but it was something. It was enough to give them hope that they could survive this strange new life they had been forced into. They still had a long way to go, but maybe they didn't have to face it alone. Zor and Kiv had been on the human ship for months now. They were no longer the scared, confused brothers who had arrived here. They had grown stronger, faster, and smarter under Captain John's tough training. But they still hadn't faced the one thing they were most afraid of: battle. They had heard rumors of humans fighting in wars, of the enemies they would face, and they weren't sure they were ready for any of it. But the day came when Captain John called them into the control room. His face was serious, his eyes hard, like they always were before a mission. "Get ready," he ordered. "We're heading into battle." Zor and Kiv exchanged worried glances. They had been trained for this moment, but now that it was real, their nerves were on edge. They had never fought a real battle, and they didn't know if they could handle the chaos, the noise, and the fear that would come with it. "We're here to survive," Captain John said, noticing their hesitation. "You've learned everything you need to. Trust in your training." The brothers nodded, trying to hide the fear in their hearts. They quickly suited up in the special human armor and rushed to their battle stations. The ship shook slightly as it entered enemy territory. The alarms blared, and the crew went into full battle mode. Everyone knew what to do, except for Zor and Kiv. They were still new to this world, and the reality of it hit them hard. Captain John stood at the front, barking orders to the crew. His voice was sharp, commanding. "Prepare for impact. Target the enemy ships. Do not hesitate." The brothers took their positions, trying to stay calm, but their hearts raced. The control room was filled with tension. Zor gripped the edge of his station, trying to steady his breathing. Kiv, beside him, was trembling slightly. He had never seen a real battle before, and he couldn't imagine what it would be like. He had always been taught to avoid conflict, not to seek it. The ship shuddered as the first enemy blasts hit, shaking the entire vessel. The battle had begun. "Fire back," Captain John shouted. His voice was firm, but there was a hint of urgency in it. "Aim for their weak points." The brothers did what they had been trained to do. Zor quickly adjusted the targeting system, while Kiv fired the first round of shots. The sound of the ship's weapons firing filled the room, followed by the loud explosions outside. Zor and Kiv felt the power behind each shot, the force that sent them flying through space. It was nothing like the training. The real battle was loud, chaotic, and terrifying. The noise of weapons, the sounds of explosions, and the strange lights flashing outside the windows made everything feel overwhelming. Zor's heart raced, and his hands shook as he adjusted the controls. The enemy ships were fast, their movements unpredictable. They were getting closer, firing at the human ship with everything they had. Zor and Kiv had to stay focused, despite the fear trying to take over their minds. They had trained for this, but nothing had prepared them for the real thing. Zor fired again, and this time, the blast hit its target. The enemy ship exploded in a burst of flames and debris. For a moment, Zor felt a rush of relief, but the battle was far from over. "We're not done yet," Captain John shouted. "Stay sharp." The brothers continued to fire, each shot feeling more intense than the last. They didn't have time to think about their fears. They had to focus on the task at hand. The battle raged on, with both sides exchanging blasts of fire. The human ship took several hits, causing the entire ship to shake with each explosion. Zor and Kiv were pushed back in their seats as the ship rocked, but they didn't stop. Hours passed, but it felt like minutes. Zor's mind was foggy, his body sore, but he pushed through. They were winning, but the cost was high. The enemy ships were relentless, but the human crew was determined. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the last enemy ship was destroyed. The remaining ships retreated, and the battle was over. The control room fell silent. Zor and Kiv looked at each other, both breathing heavily. They were alive. They had made it through their first battle, but the reality of what they had just experienced sank in. The chaos, the destruction, the fear, it was all real. Captain John turned to them, his face still serious but with a small nod of approval. "You did well," he said. "You held your ground. You survived." Zor and Kiv were stunned. They had expected to be told they could have done better, that they needed to try harder. But instead, Captain John was acknowledging their efforts. They had proven themselves. As the brothers stood in the control room, staring out at the stars, they realized something important. They weren't the same brothers who had arrived on this ship. They had been tested, and they had survived. They weren't just orphans anymore. They were fighters. They were survivors, and they had the strength to face whatever came next. The days after the first battle were quiet, but not peaceful. Zor and Kiv had changed. They had fought in a real battle and survived. They weren't the same scared brothers who had first stepped onto the human ship, but there was still something they hadn't figured out, their relationship with Captain John. Before the battle, they had respected him because he was their leader. But now, after seeing him in action, something inside them had shifted. They were starting to see him in a new light. He wasn't just a harsh human who trained them. He was a warrior, a leader who had led them into battle without hesitation and had fought alongside them. One evening, after a long day of drills and training, Zor and Kiv sat in the common room of the ship. The place was quiet, with only the hum of the ship's engine filling the silence. Zor leaned back in his seat, his thoughts deep in his mind. "Kiv, do you ever wonder why Captain John does this? Why he pushes us so hard?" Kiv shrugged, still trying to shake the exhaustion of the day off. "I think he does it because he cares. He wants us to be ready. He wants us to survive out there." Zor nodded slowly. "Yeah, but he's not like other leaders. He's different. He doesn't show his emotions. But when we were in battle, I saw something in him. He wasn't just a captain. He was human. He cared about us more than we thought." Kiv's eyes widened. "You think so? I've always felt like he didn't care at all. He's so tough on us, like we're just another mission to him." Zor smiled, a small grin that barely reached his eyes. "I used to think that too. But now, I'm not so sure. I think he's trying to teach us something. He wants us to be strong, not just for the mission, but for ourselves." Kiv was quiet for a moment. He had never looked at Captain John that way before. But now, as he thought about it, he realized Zor was right. The captain wasn't just some cold, distant leader. He had put his life on the line for them. He had led them through their first battle, and he had trusted them to fight alongside him. That kind of trust was rare, and Kiv was beginning to understand just how much respect he owed Captain John. The next morning, the brothers were summoned to the command deck again. They had been training hard for days, but this time it felt different. They didn't know what to expect, but they were ready for whatever came next. Captain John stood at the front, looking over the crew. His expression was as stern as ever, but today there was something else in his eyes. Something that Zor and Kiv couldn't quite place. "Today," Captain John said, his voice steady, "we are going to conduct a final test. We've trained, we've fought, and now it's time to see if you're truly ready for what's ahead." Zor and Kiv stood straight, their minds focused. They didn't know what the test would be, but they had learned to trust Captain John's judgment. He wouldn't ask them to do anything they couldn't handle. The test turned out to be another battle. This time, however, it was different. The enemy was fierce, and the battle was long and intense. But as the hours passed, Zor and Kiv found themselves working together more smoothly than ever before. They trusted each other now, and they trusted Captain John too. Through the chaos, they noticed something. Captain John was always where he needed to be, always leading them, always giving them the right orders at the right time. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a leader in every sense of the word. And for the first time, Zor and Kiv realized that they weren't just following orders. They were fighting for something bigger. They were fighting for each other. After the battle, as the ship drifted back to safety, the brothers gathered with the rest of the crew. They were tired, bruised, and worn out, but they had won. And for the first time, they felt like part of something important. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. They were learning. And most importantly, they were growing. Captain John stood before them, his eyes scanning the crew. "Good work," he said simply. "You've earned my respect. You've proven that you can survive. But more than that, you've proven that you're ready to be a part of this team." Zor and Kiv looked at each other, both of them stunned. For the first time, Captain John had spoken to them like equals. He had respected their efforts, their growth. It was the first time they had felt truly accepted. "Thank you, Captain," Zor said quietly. Kiv nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "We won't let you down." Captain John gave them a small, approving nod. "I know you won't. You're not just soldiers. You're family now. And family looks out for each other." As the brothers left the command deck, they felt something inside them shift. The walls they had built around their hearts were starting to come down. They had found respect, not just for Captain John, but for themselves as well. They had learned that respect wasn't given. It was earned. And they had earned it through their hard work, their determination, and their willingness to fight for something bigger than themselves. The days after their victory in battle were peaceful, but Zor and Kiv couldn't stop thinking about Captain John. They had learned to respect him as a leader, but now something else was beginning to happen. They were starting to understand him in a way they hadn't before. It wasn't just about the training or the battles anymore. It was about who Captain John really was, as a person. For weeks, Captain John had been their harsh instructor, pushing them to be better. He had trained them, guided them, and even fought beside them. But there were moments when they saw something in him that confused them, something beyond the tough exterior. One day, after a long training session, Zor and Kiv found themselves in the ship's small kitchen, grabbing some food. They were exhausted, their bodies sore from the constant drills, but something felt different in the air. Captain John walked in, his usual serious expression on his face. He didn't speak at first, just looked at the brothers quietly. Zor and Kiv didn't know what to say. They had learned to stay silent around him, knowing that every word he spoke carried weight. But today was different. Today, Captain John seemed lost in thought. "You've been pushing us harder than ever," Zor said finally, breaking the silence. "Why?" Captain John turned toward him, his eyes narrowing slightly, but there was no anger in them. Instead, there was a hint of sadness, something the brothers hadn't expected. "I push you because I know what it takes to survive," Captain John replied quietly. "When I was your age, I didn't have anyone to train me. I had to learn everything the hard way. I made mistakes, many of them. I don't want you to make the same ones." Zor and Kiv exchanged a quick glance. They hadn't expected that answer. They had always thought that Captain John pushed them so hard because he had no feelings. They had assumed he was cold, a warrior who cared about nothing but winning. But now, they were starting to see a different side of him. Kiv spoke up next, his voice softer than usual. "But why? Why are you so hard on us? You don't need to be." Captain John let out a deep sigh and leaned against the wall, his eyes looking far away. "Because I care," Because I know that the world out there is unforgiving. If you're not strong, if you don't know how to fight, you won't survive. And I'd lost too many people to let that happen to you." Zor and Kiv didn't know what to say. They had always seen Captain John as someone who didn't show emotions, someone who didn't care about anything except the mission. But now, they were starting to realize that there was more to him than that. He was a man who had been through a lot, a man who had lost much, and he was doing everything in his power to make sure they didn't face the same pain. The room grew quiet, the only sound the hum of the ship's engine. Zor and Kiv stood there, processing Captain John's words. They didn't know what to say, but they felt a shift inside themselves. They had always seen him as a leader, but now they were seeing him as a person. "You've lost people?" Zor asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Captain John's eyes hardened, the pain of the past still fresh in his mind. "Yes, I've lost friends, family, people I cared about. That's why I push you. I don't want to lose anyone else." Kiv looked at him, his heart heavy with understanding. "You're not just training us to fight. You're training us to survive." Captain John nodded slowly, his eyes meeting theirs. "Exactly. I've seen too many people who weren't prepared for the reality of war. I've seen what happens to those who don't know how to survive. I won't let that happen to you." Zor and Kiv didn't speak for a long time. They had learned something important today, not just about Captain John, but about themselves. They had always been focused on surviving, on becoming strong enough to fight. But now, they understood why they had to be strong. It wasn't just about winning battles. It was about keeping the people they cared about safe. It was about protecting their future. As the days went by, the brothers noticed changes in Captain John. He wasn't as harsh as he used to be. He still pushed them to be their best. But now, there was something different in his eyes. He was still a warrior, but he was also a teacher, a protector, and someone who cared for them in a way they hadn't realized before. One evening, after another long day of training, Zor and Kiv found themselves standing by the ship's observation window, looking out at the stars. They were deep in thought, reflecting on everything they had learned. "I think I understand him now," Zor said quietly. Kiv nodded. "Yeah, he's not just a soldier. He's someone who's been through a lot. He's trying to make sure we don't make the same mistakes." Zor smiled slightly. "I think he cares more than he lets on." Kiv smiled back. "Yeah, I think you're right." They stood there for a while, looking out at the endless expanse of stars. They had come a long way since their first days on the ship. They were no longer the scared brothers who didn't understand anything. They had learned to fight, to survive, and most importantly, they had learned that even in the toughest of humans, there was a heart that cared. And for the first time, Zor and Kiv felt like they truly understood the man who had trained them. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were part of something bigger. They were part of a family. The days turned into weeks, and life aboard the ship became routine for Zor and Kiv. They had trained hard, fought hard, and learned more than they ever thought possible. But the biggest lesson of all had come when they started to understand Captain John, not just as a leader, but as a person. They realized that the tough, unfeeling man they had first met wasn't the whole story. He was someone who had been through pain, loss, and heartache. He was someone who cared, even if he didn't always show it. One evening, after a long day of training, Zor and Kiv sat together in the ship's common area. The room was quiet, and the soft hum of the ship filled the space. They were tired, their bodies sore from the hard work, but there was something else in the air. A sense of calm, something they hadn't felt before. "I can't believe how far we've come," Zor said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes on the ceiling. Kiv nodded in agreement, his mind still processing everything that had happened. "Yeah. When we first got here, we didn't know what to expect. Now, I feel different, stronger, like we belong here." Zor smiled, his eyes thoughtful. "We do belong here." Captain John made sure of that. It was true. Captain John had pushed them harder than they had ever been pushed. He had been tough on them, demanding their best every day. But he had also shown them something else, the importance of strength, not just physical, but emotional and mental as well. He had taught them what it meant to fight for something bigger than themselves. As the brothers sat in silence, the door to the common room opened, and Captain John walked in. He looked as serious as ever, but his eyes softened when he saw the brothers. "You two done with training for the day?" he asked, his voice steady, but with a hint of something else, something warmer. Zor and Kiv stood up, instinctively saluting. But this time, it wasn't just out of habit. It was a sign of respect, a respect that had grown between them over the past few months. "Yeah, Captain," Kiv replied. "We're done for the day." Captain John nodded, walking over to the table where the brothers had been sitting. He seemed lost in thought for a moment, as if he had something important on his mind. "I've been thinking," Captain John said, looking directly at them. "You've both come a long way since we first met. You've earned my respect. But more than that, you've earned something else." Zor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that, Captain?" Captain John smiled. A rare sight. It was small, but it was there. "You've earned the right to call yourselves family." The words hit Zor and Kiv like a wave. Family. They had always been alone, drifting from place to place, never knowing what it meant to have a real family. But now, standing before Captain John, they realized something. They had found it. They had found family in each other, in Captain John, and in the people they had fought beside. "We're family?" Zor asked, his voice quiet, almost uncertain. Captain John nodded, his gaze firm but warm. "Yes, you are. You've proven yourselves, not just as soldiers, but as people who care for each other. You're part of this crew. You're part of my family. And family looks out for each other." Kiv felt a warmth spread through him. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged somewhere. He wasn't just an orphan anymore. He wasn't just a soldier. He was part of something bigger. He was part of a family. "I don't know what to say," Kiv whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Zor put a hand on his brother's shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "You don't have to say anything. We're family. That's enough." Captain John looked at them both, his eyes filled with something they hadn't seen before, a softness, a care that wasn't there before. "You're right," Captain John said. "You don't have to say anything. But I'm proud of you both. You've come so far. And I'm glad to have you by my side. We've been through a lot together, and we'll face even more challenges ahead. But we'll face them as a family. Together." The brothers nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep in their hearts. They had been through so much already. They had fought battles, survived dangerous missions, and faced their fears. But through it all, they had learned the most important lesson of all, that they weren't alone anymore. They had found a family in each other, and that was something they would never lose. As the days went on, Zor, Kiv, and Captain John continued to fight side by side. They faced new challenges, new enemies, and new battles. But they were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting for each other. They were fighting for their family. And no matter what came next, they knew one thing for sure. Family would always come first. No matter how tough the battle, no matter how far the distance, they would always have each other. They were family forever.